Well, welcome. This is the first of a series of 4 classes called Waking Up to the Noble Journey. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present this with my good buddy, Father Jonathan. And this is definitely an experiment. And we hope you'll see not just from the content of what we're presenting, but in the way we go about presenting is more to the point of what we're trying to get across. So I think you will experience this as being something different from just one person lecturing and the other person lecturing. We're going to be going back and forth and kind of improvising off of each other's inspirations to see what comes out. And a lot of what comes out will have to do with you who are here. I mean, there's an energy field created when there's a group of people that are tuned in for a common purpose. So we'll see what happens. So let me just first read the little description we had for this. The full title is Waking Up to the Noble Journey, Imagination, Wonder, and Spirituality in a Quantum Reality. The imaginal faculty is an element of our subtle world by which we can increase the meaningfulness of beings and things in manifestation, modulate consciousness, amplify subtle energies, infuse beings and things with light, and transform our existence. So what we're going to be getting across in this class, this first session, is kind of an introduction to a very powerful tool that we all possess, which is our imagination. And this is a tool which we use all the time, but we don't think of it as using it because it has a lot to do with the reality that we live in and what we presume is the reality that we live in and who we presume that we are, which in actuality is a very small bit of the actuality of who we are.
Okay.
There we go.
Well,
Yeah.
This began as a conversation. Don and I sit together monthly. Diane and I sit together monthly, and we kind of throw ideas around. The way you and I typically start is one of us says, "So what have you been thinking about recently?" And then from there, it goes into usually an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. I think once we've gone 2 hours of exploration and wonder. And so part of what we're, as you said very well, is part of what we realized after about a year of doing this is that that process is an incarnational, in the Christian language, we would call that an incarnational process, where you are participating in that which you are aspiring to be nourished by. That you are connecting to the divine presence. Even as you're talking about the divine presence, it's manifesting right in the midst. And that unfoldingness energizes us, I mean, infinitely, right? Can I say that?
Indeed, yes.
Right. So we're so excited about it that we thought we might invite you into it. But I'm just going to say this, even if you don't like it, it's a guarantee that we're gonna. So, sorry.
No refunds.
No refunds. Because if we do this well, we're going to have a great time, and we hope that might then spark some other conversation as well. But I think we think that there is something about this kind of manifestation that is illuminative or instructive about how manifestation might actually happen. Again, manifestation and incarnation are 2 words that help us understand making divine presence. Present presence. Does that help?
Yes.
Well?
And so
Somebody's raising their hand already.
Well, we're going to
hold on to that.
Questions.
Just a second.
So what we hope to demonstrate in the way we go back and forth is not just something that we can do.
Right.
It's something that we all can do with each other, with another person, but not just with people, with anything that we're in relationship with. But we'll get into that kind of thing a little bit later. So I'd like to say a little bit about one of my favorite Sufi mystics, Ibn Arabi, who lived, I think, in the 1200s, who was so ahead of his time. In fact, he still is. He's the most profound mystic I've ever come across. And if I had to pull out just one sentence from his teachings, it would be this. He said, every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever could or will have access to. So no, he didn't say, well, only the great prophets of Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, and so on had this access. He said every being, and in fact in his teachings he said God told the prophet Muhammad that the prophet Muhammad needed to learn from his followers because each of them had access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no one else had access to. So if you buy that, you have no excuse ever again for low self-esteem. And I sincerely mean that. I mean, each of you has got something waiting for you to discover, and what is waiting for you to discover is not sitting somewhere in the Akashic records. It hasn't come into existence yet, but it comes into existence by your relationship with the totality that each of us is an integral part of. Now, Jonathan mentioned our conversations would start with like one idea. So one idea that I had in one of our recent conversations was that we tend to each live in a simulation. So if you're familiar with Star Trek, the holodeck is a simulation. But sometimes the people that went on the holodeck got so caught up in the experience they didn't realize that it was a simulation. They thought it was reality. And we've all probably had dreams in which we didn't know we were dreaming, and it seemed so real, and then you wake up from that. Well, we are all usually living in a simulation, and because it's a mass common simulation, we don't realize it, and it's not even on the table to think that that could be a possibility. So what do I mean by living in a simulation? We perceive through our five senses, and we tend to presume without question that that is all there is to reality. Well, if you've ever looked at pictures from different kinds of telescopes, infrared and radio telescopes and X-ray telescopes, or even seen pictures of what flowers look like to bees that can perceive ultraviolet, it's like, oh, wow, I don't see that.
Right.
Well, we don't realize that's all a part of the reality. There's sounds we can't hear. There's smells we can't smell. So even in the realm of physical sensations, we have a very limited aspect of what we can perceive. But there's so much more to reality, and the mystics have said this for thousands of years, that there's different subtle realms of reality. And now scientists, I think we would say for the most part, believe that there, in all likelihood, are multiple dimensions, and depending on the theory, it's 10 dimensions or 21 dimensions, but we live in 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. Well, what are all these other dimensions? Well, there are ways of opening our perception to a much richer way of experiencing the world, and our imagination, we could say, is the subtle organ tool of consciousness. So we have consciousness. You can think about what I'm saying. You can think about what you're going to do later today, and so on. You can imagine almost anything, and perhaps some of you have had mystical experiences that seem to be some very different place, but the way that we shift our consciousness is using the subtle faculty of imagination. And we can either be at the mercy of imagination, just on autopilot, reacting and having the usual responses to situations, cognitive, emotional, or so on. And we also have the capability of using imagination to free ourselves from that constricted vantage point. So the title, Waking Up to the Noble Journey, well, waking up requires freeing ourselves from the usual. And this process of waking up is not linear. It's not smooth. It's not gradual. It can't be. We tend to think in our spiritual journey we're just going to add a little bit of this and a little bit of that and get some good mojo from this part and that. It does not work like that. There have to be quantum leaps and shifts.
So then what...
Yeah.
So then right there is one of those places where we need to wake up, and it's in your hand motions. We've been talking about this, how we're so caught up in a container of perception and a container of reality, or at least an imagined container of reality, that when we describe things that are divine or heavenly, how do we typically describe them? Or where do we look to see them? Where would we think they are? typically we go like this. And we typically talk about consciousness growth as this kind of ascending consciousness growth. So we tend to say, I'm gonna climb the ladder, or I'm gonna go deeper. Okay? That right there is part of the illusion. That right there is part of the question, is what are we, and we get that for all kinds of wonderful reasons. Because that's the evolution of human thought. Human thought began with this concept of everything that matters is kind of right close at hand, and at some point we might want to fast forward it rather than do a long story of human thought. We might want to fast forward to kind of the pre-Copernican or before the time we realized that we weren't the center of the universe. We might remember the story of having the belief that everything that mattered was right here with us. Humanity is the most important thing, and that we might be standing on the most important rock, surrounded by these other things, but that everything that matters and everything that really is right here. So then thought evolved to say, well, if there is anything that's better, it can't be here, it has to be there, because that's kind of the two-dimensional world we force ourselves into. There's a writer named, if you're in the Christian tradition at all, there's a writer named Ilia Delio, who's kind of one of my favorites. She's an incredible theologian and writer, and she does, I think, one of the best, and it's in the introduction to her book. That's the kind of stuff that she does. One of the best outlines of this evolution of thought that goes from pre-Copernican, where the Earth is the center of everything, to Galileo, where he gets punished for saying things like that, but then also this idea then that we start saying, okay, the Earth isn't the center of everything, but then who is it next? Newton, I guess we would kind of say. The Newtonian universe says, well, everything, we might not be the center of everything, but everything certainly adheres to a certain fixed group of laws, and everything fixes to those laws, so everything is kind of either in sequence or up and down, and that physical reality determines our spiritual reality, so that we don't think of spirit as being quantumly present. We start thinking of spirit as being very linearly attainable. So when we think of time going this way or time going this way. But that's not quite it as well, because we start talking to people like Einstein, who start saying time is kind of, as Doctor Who would say, wibbly wobbly. It doesn't quite function that way. But then the quantum theorists come along and say, time. That's the most we can say, is that there's time, because time has this mysterious, or reality has this mysterious quality of being full of everything, full of time. There is no such thing as a linear past, present, and future when you're living in a quantum reality. It's all kind of present and possible. So that's part of the work we're trying to have a conversation about as well, is that when the ancient mystics, or even when the current mystics, accessed some of their the energy of what might really be going on in the most real, they probably weren't describing the world like we do in our limited kind of container framework. Ibn Arabi, Jesus of Nazareth, I think even some of Paul's teaching, when Paul said the body of Christ, he was describing a metaphysical possibility, kind of playing around with language as much as he could, that wasn't only a process, but that was an eternal reality that it actually is. It's not a sequential thing. It actually an isness that's there. And living in our simulation has created a reality in which that's the only thing we can see. For example, whenever we have a conflict around the world, how do we need in our own selfhood to talk about that conflict? Friend or enemy? Friend or foe? Okay? Now that's not bad. That's actually a well-adapted strategy in our human life. At the same time, there's more realities going on in that container. When we start thinking about growth or meaningfulness or the presence of the divine or the presence of light, we tend to say we need to go access the light, or I need to open myself to the divine, or we say things like I need to have a spiritual life. And increasingly more and more theologians, teachers, and mystics are saying there's no such thing as a spiritual or a non-spiritual. There's no such thing as a mystical or non-mystical. It's all eternally present. It's all eternally possible. And that is part of the conversation that we're living into.
And the problem that keeps us living in the simulation is that we don't keep up with the discoveries of science, such as the quantum theory, which says that everything is interconnected. Everything is interconnected, not even spatially, but temporally, and even beyond those. We live in a reality in which we are separated from what we experience. Mm-hmm. And so in our daily life, but also in our spirituality, we tend to live in a dualistic framework for spirituality. We think of God as something separate. We think of the heavenly realms, whatever different systems have different numbers, the angelic realm, the jinn realm, and so on. They're up there. When someone dies, they're in the other place. But there is no other place. It's all here. But the problem is our perception limits what we're capable of experiencing. And another problem, and I would say even with the spiritual traditions, so they recognized thousands of years ago that dualistic perception wasn't going to cut it. And that's not really how things are. So reality is described either as just an illusion, Maya, or, well, maybe there's something to it, but it's not where it's at. The point is to get out of here and get to the good stuff. But the good stuff is a state of being in which generally there's no more individuality. There's no more identity. There's a merger into, and depending on the tradition, it could be called moksha, mukti, illumination, nirvana, whatever, but the personal identity is thought to be, well, that's an illusion too. Well, in one sense it is, but not the way that you think about it. And so another, I think, very important contribution of the Sufis, which is a tradition that Diane and I have been a part of, and some of you here have been a part of for some time, talk about the purpose of existence is awakening of divinity in life. Well, how does divinity awaken in life? It awakens through every aspect of manifestation, including human beings, and it awakens through each unique aspect of manifestation. Every one of you is a unique manifestation of the divine being experiencing your human nature in life, and your relationship with all the other manifestations of the divine in manifestation, but also in what we might think of as the transcendent realms, with whatever your notion of the beyond is. We're all part of that cosmic relationship in which each part is unique, each part has something to contribute to the totality. So we think of our spiritual journey, why are we doing it? Well, I want to become enlightened. I want to become illuminated. I want to get to heaven. I want to get to nirvana or whatever. But at a certain point, I believe that in any authentic spiritual process, we realize that what we thought of was for our own benefit, that was an illusion too, because it's for the benefit of everything that each of us uniquely contributes to. And in that process, we never can lose the uniqueness of our identity. That's the precious aspect of divinity that has been bequeathed to each of us as something to unfold, something to evolve, and not to evolve to some fixed conclusion that God up in the heaven is going, well, maybe they'll get there eventually, and now they've progressed to here and here and here. What we think of is that God cannot possibly have any idea of what you're going to become, and if that were possible, it wouldn't be real. It would be just back to the Newtonian existence where it's a clockwork universe, everything is fixed. So there's the wonderful unpredictability of waking up to the noble journey, because each of us has so much to do with how that journey unfolds and how we can contribute to it. And our imagination is a very powerful tool for that.
There's this concept, and we've talked about this before in the mystics, Christian mysticism. And I mean, this should be obvious, but let's make sure we have everybody know. I speak out of the Christian tradition. That's my well that I draw from. You tend to draw from a well that is the Sufi tradition. and a whole lot of other awesome stuff. I just want to say, you have maybe 2 or 3 wells, I think you drove from, which is pretty great. But there is this tradition, as you talk about divinization, or the language you could talk about was this divinization, or this idea of manifestation in the individual. Sometimes what we talk about is the linkages in Christianity, because it can be concerning, or it can be curious where the linkages between what you classically describe as Sufi, or what we might call a version of mystical Islam. Is that fair to say it that way?
Well, the Sufis would say, at least some Sufis would say, that anyone who's a sincere seeker of wisdom is a Sufi, whether they call themselves that or not.
Right.
And many Muslims would say that only Muslims can be Sufis, and it belongs to Islam. Well,
right.
Sufism has existed from Adam. I mean, and the Egyptian mystery schools and the tradition of the Magi, and they've always, through the centuries, the teachers have welcomed people from all faiths to what they taught, because they realized that the truth cannot belong to this tradition or to that tradition.
So that's really important. There is, of course, traditions in all religious traditions. There's a tendency in all religious traditions to make exclusionary claims about access to wisdom. And here we might just say, we're probably not going to spend a lot of time focusing on those exclusionary claims, or at least I won't, except to maybe deconstruct them a bit and recognize that they might not be helpful. Because at the same time that the tradition that became now known as Sufism, or Sufis, have been around since ancient times, let's just remember that Judaism, Christianity did not exist within an isolated group, and that these traditions rubbed up against one another. So there's some wonderful cross-pollination that happened, and there's some particular reasons why Christianity was very interested in not having any of that cross-pollination really kind of make it down the streamline to what we now might call formal, organized Christianity. Part of that, which is Christianity over time became very convinced and very concerned about maintaining a claim to an exclusive access to both divine inspiration, but also heavenly ascent upon death, or heaven. And that became very, very important to Christianity right about the 4th, 5th century. What's interesting about that is that when Christians kind of study this, Christianity likes to say, we made these claims and there are claims to make. Well, they weren't their claims. They were borrowing from Plato. Which is that Christianity does what all religious groups did, which is borrow stuff from other people and then make it themselves. It's what we now call appropriation. It's just humanity. We just do that. So the Platonic philosophical idea of that there's an ideal realm there in somewhere else other than us is kind of what then got mashed into what we might call Neoplatonism in Christianity, where then the important thing is there is this divine realm, and the question is, how do I get there? And Christianity, as it emerged from Judaism, really got concerned about getting into that divine realm. But if you remember, Judaism is not interested in that much at all. There's not claims in the Old Testament of when you die, you go to heaven. In fact, there aren't claims of that in the Gospels either. You just kind of have to get into that. That Jesus does talks about a promise, or a place where we might have oneness. But even when asked, how do you punch your ticket to that place, Jesus says, that's not my business. He calls the Father's business. That's somebody else's business. So even invited to make exclusionary claims, Jesus was somewhat reticent to do that. There are times when he does. Interestingly enough, it's inconsistent among the Gospels, which tells me more about the writers of the Gospels than it does about Jesus of Nazareth. And that's kind of important. So then, what you're talking about, this idea of what we kind of call divinization, you didn't say divinization, you called it this eternal nature of our humanity, right? How did you describe that?
The awakening of divinity in life.
The awakening of our divinity in life. That actually, in early Christianity, has a very strong voice, and particularly Eastern Christianity. Not the Latin Christianity that most of us come from. It's called theosis in the Eastern Church. And it's worth saying, when we say the Eastern Church, geographically, it's the church basically from Syria eastward, right? Going further east, maybe parts of Turkey, maybe parts of Greek, but the Greek-speaking theology that emerged, which had a lot of connection to what we now would say is Sufism, or the mystery traditions around Sufism as well. This idea that the work is not only a divine ascent that happens upon death, and we need to live a moral life in order to get there, but the real juice of life is to participate in what's called theosis right here, that we are being transformed always and ongoingly into what some Eastern Christian mystics say our truest nature, to become our truest self, our divine true self. Many of us did not grow up in church where we talk that way. I guess that's all I really wanted to say. But like most things, I take 10 minutes to say.
Well, and I'm going to do a little segue into a limitation that's, I would say, rampant in science, which you could call scientific fundamentalism.
Excellent.
So I want to tell a little story about this researcher named William Tiller, who did really wonderful research on subtle energy for decades. I mean, replicable, came to proofs of things that really contradicted the usual laws of physics. He showed that an intention could be stored in something that shouldn't be able to store anything and influence something at a distance, such as changing the pH in water, raising it or lowering it. And so he had this whole theory with equations beyond my math major ability at Stanford to understand, to show how subtle energy adds factors to the usual equations of physics, that now things are possible that weren't possible before. Well, William Tiller related a story that he was at a conference where he was on a panel with some very well-known conventional physicists, and he got through presenting his research, and the well-known conventional physicist turned to him and said, "Even if what you're saying is true, I don't believe it." Now, we laugh at that, but we have, and sometimes we may laugh at religious fundamentalists or think, oh, you know, they're, but we have, I would say that we all perhaps suffer from some degree of spiritual fundamentalism. And what do I mean by that? I mean notions that have been present for hundreds of years, particularly in Western religion, about God, we take without question. So what are some of these? God is omnipotent. God is omnipresent. Okay, let's take omnipotent. God knows everything. So that means God knows everything that ever could happen. Well, along comes quantum physics and says you can't ever know everything. Even the act of observation is going to change what you're looking at. So unless God's not playing fair and doesn't abide by the rules that are part of existence, God couldn't know everything, because it's the nature of evolution that there has to be an open-endedness to it, where there's possibilities that can emerge that couldn't be foreseen. If you know anything about chaos theory, if you have a chaotic system, it's at some degree of equilibrium, and now there's this in-between state where it looks like a big mess, and you can't tell from looking at that or looking at the initial conditions what it's going to turn into. There's all those possibilities that are latent in that. So, spirituality, part of the spiritual fundamentalism we tend to have is that the purpose of existence is, okay, humanity has gotten separated from God, humanity needs to go back to God, humanity needs to fix itself up, and in some traditions just disappear and merge into cosmic consciousness. In other traditions, you know, get your act together, get fixed up enough, and then you get your reward after this life. But you're still in a dualistic state of relationship.
And that's basically Plato.
Yeah. And I'll add to this, the archetypes. And here's another, I'd say, philosophical fundamentalism that certainly is still widespread, is that the archetypes can't change. Well, wait a minute, what's he talking about? An archetype of a circle, that can't change. The archetype of a rose, that can't change. Well, think about the archetypes. The Sufis talk about the divine qualities, and they have many, many names for God, for the different aspects. And let's say there's 99. It could be the divine beauty, the divine truth, the divine compassion, the divine wisdom. But usually they're thought of as just being these fixed, unchanging qualities that we can get some sense of. We feel them coming through us. We feel them acting on us. We feel them transforming us, but we don't have anything to do with those qualities changing. Well, I do not believe that. I believe that those qualities themselves are evolved by the unique way that we experience them. So even beauty, when we experience beauty of anything and really have a deeply connected experience, and I'm sure all of us have had experiences being at places like the Grand Canyon or Yosemite, or those of you that saw the eclipse here yesterday, I mean, wow. I mean, that was just so, I mean, just beyond words, seeing that little ring of fire up in the sky. You're in this transported state. Something is added now to anyone that has any experience of beauty forevermore because of every person's experience. Now I want to do another little segue here. So this is what can happen from an individual. We can have an impact, think of this, on transforming divine qualities, and by inference, helping to evolve the divine being. That's just each of us. But when two people have a connection and have a relationship and have an interaction, back to Ibn Arabi, each person's got access to a unique part of the divine wisdom. You could say a unique flavor of light that transpires through them. And you have two people that are really connecting, and we feel that when that happens. I mean, you're just really on a roll of inspiration. Now, both people are having inspirations that neither one ever would or could have thought of on their own, because there's been an interplay of the emergent wisdom of each person. So now there's like an exponentially increased capacity for transformation of the qualities that are coming through. And that same thing can happen in our relationship with anything, something in nature, a situation that we're experiencing. I like to say that every situation is potentially a portal, P-O-R-T-A-L, an opening to the sacred, but it has to do with our way of relating to that situation. And that does not mean the situation is magically going to become wonderful. It may still appear just as horrible as it ever was, but something is opened up by our way of relating to it, seeing a possibility of something that can arise in our way of connecting with it. And we'll be getting into more about this in future times together.
Yeah, I mean, the rhyme that I'm hearing there is when we talk in the Christian tradition, and not all do, but there's a strong teaching in Christianity that the mystery of incarnation, the mystery of presence, the mystery of creation, the mystery of divine revelation is not closed, but is always unfolding and ongoing. That's classically described nowadays in a kind of a school of thought called process theology. You might want to look that up. Just a little coda around that. When I went to seminary, I was cautioned in 99. Wow. I was cautioned by mentors of mine, and this is literally what they said. I mean, I sat down at a lunch table, and there were two priests who sat down, men, of course, older men, nothing against older men, but they had kind of a thing going on. And they filled me with directions, and one of them was, be on the lookout for process theology.
Here it is.
It is heresy. But at the same time, that's one of the questions of process theology isn't everything unfolding? And if that unfoldingness is possible, then isn't it possible that all of our concepts of God and all of our questions about God may be unfolding? And is it possible then that God's own selfhood might be unfolding, and that God's own reality might be, we've said this before, ongoing and continuing to create, that creation is not static but is continuing to create? And by the way, science has a lot to say about that, that there is this ongoingness of creation that is always unfolding. Lest we think that's not in Scripture, go to church in about 40 minutes, because you're going to hear a story. And it's going to tell you that God and Moses were having an argument, or actually God was griping. God was the one, by the way, I'm just going to say it this way. Can I cuss in here? I'm going to cuss on that.
Hell yes.
Okay. God was losing his shit. Okay. God was having a meltdown at the top of the mountain and was saying, those people, I'm getting rid of them. And Moses is the one who's the grown-up in the room. He's the only calm one in the entire story. And then Moses reminds God of God's own selfhood. Moses has a hand in reshaping the divine presence. And God, it says in the scriptures, changes God's mind, changes his mind. Okay? That's a mind blower. So when you read that, and then you're going to hear that, by the way, also in Abraham, the story of Abraham arguing with God about whether God should get rid of all the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And God's going to wipe them all out. And Abraham says, crazy, crazy, crazy. That's not really good. How about maybe, and Abraham talks him down. But here's the thing that modern non-process theology does with that. Okay? Which is this. Of course, God was never going to kill everybody. God was testing Moses. But that's not in the story. Nowhere is that in the story. It's not in the Hebrew, and it's not even in the ancient reflections. What's the commentary around the story as well? It's that God is as involved in this unfolding creation as we are. That the divine relationship is not a divine relationship from the future calling us forward, that God is in the midst of this unfolding reality as we are involved in this unfolding reality. Now, right there, I can't count the number of interesting conversations I can have with people who are very faithful, and there might be some here as well, and there's nothing wrong with a good conversation, but that is a challenging notion in much of what we might call classic Christianity. But it's right there in front of us. And by the way, Judaism has a way of accepting that possibility, that there is this, not many forms of Judaism, not all, there is this possibility that God is involved in an unfoldingness.
Well, I've got something to add to that. Many years ago, maybe a few of you attended, I did a series of classes on the Kabbalah. And
right.
In preparing for those classes, I came across something I had never seen anywhere before. And it was in some mystical writing of Judaism. It said before this creation, our creation in the beginning, God created the heavens and so on. But it said there were, let's say, 1,000 previous creations, and God was dissatisfied with all of them, so he just wiped them out. He erased them. Okay, we're going to give it another try. Well, hopefully this one doesn't get erased. But what you can take from that is another freeing ourselves from spiritual fundamentalism is the notion that there ever could be what we think of as a perfect static God. If God were static, then God could never be a living God. We could never have a living experience of God, and we can only experience God through the way of relationship with ourselves and other manifestations of the divine in manifestation, and or even R.B. talks about each of us has our own personal Lord, or sometimes personal angel, as opposed to what he calls the corporate God. The corporate God is like the stereotype God, Allah in Islam, or just God in Christianity.
Adonai.
Yeah, Judaism. Lord. But interestingly, in the Kabbalah and the Sephiroth, the tree of life, the Sephiroth are the different stations in there, and they represent different states of relationship of the human being and their consciousness and their capacity of relating to the transcendent divine, and there's a different name of God for each one. And so that name of God describes the nature of that relationship. So I've thought this many years ago, that if you stack the world scriptures in historical order, they're like an ongoing journal of the human-divine relationship, and both sides are always transforming to the scriptures. And then the Prophet Muhammad comes along, and it said he's the seal of the prophet. Well, what does that mean? That there was no longer a need for there to be an announced prophet for all of humanity. It was like each person has the capacity of discovering their own unique divinity and expression of that divinity. So let's wind the clock all the way back to we live in this simulation. We don't know we're in it. Well, step one is realizing that we exist, if you don't like simulation, we exist in a state of ongoing limitation. So let's say we have a wonderful experience of a beautiful place in nature, or listening to wonderful music, or hearing wonderful poetry, and we're really transported by it. But then the tendency is to pull back into our thoughts about what we just experienced. That was really great. That reminds me of so-and-so, and our emotions in response to it, and we're no longer present to what's going on. We could be in the most beautiful place in the world, but we wouldn't really be present to it. We're often our separated thoughts about what we've experienced. So step one, which is an ongoing step, is learning how to be present. Well, you might be thinking, hey, I got up early on a Sunday morning. What do you want from me? I'm present at your class. Leave me alone already. Yes, you're physically present, but perhaps some of you, while you're here, have worries on your mind. That's understandable. You're thinking about other things. You're thinking about what you're going to do later today. You're thinking about maybe good things that are coming up. But that keeps you from being present. So it's like pulling our consciousness to the immediate circumstance that we're in and bringing all of ourselves to that situation. So your bodies are here. Yes, you are physically present. Check. Are you mentally present? Some degree. If you wrote down all your thoughts that you had during the course of our interaction here, and this isn't any criticism, this is human nature. Some of them would have been your responses. Well, yeah, that reminds me of so-and-so. But others would have been, drifting off to other things.
Grocery list.
Yeah. Are you emotionally present? Maybe you got something that's really weighing on your heart, and then that's... So if we can bring ourselves to a full state of presence, and we might think of that in a dualistic way, okay, now I'm being present, like that's something static. Well, no, that's not something static. Presence is something that emerges in an ongoing way when we are present with something. It arises in that situation. Sacredness is not something that is just sitting there and you go up into the sanctuary, okay, now, well, yes, you may feel that this is a sacred place, but when you really open up to it, something is arising, something is bubbling, something is stirring, something is cooking in you. That sacredness is alive when we're present in that way. So presence is an emergent property. Sacredness is an emergent property. We can use the faculty of our imagination to, first of all, rein things in. Sometimes in Hinduism or yoga, they have this beautiful image of, we have a chariot and there's like 100 horses. They call them vrittis. They're all the different human desires, and this horse is pulling this way and that one's pulling that way. Well, you don't want to kill the horses. You're not going to get anywhere if you do that. And animal rights would really get on you if you did that. But you can tame those horses, so now you are the charioteer. Well, the Bhagavad Gita, which to me is the most amazing world scripture, Krishna, the incarnation of God, is the chariot driver for his disciple Arjuna. He's emulating how that you help to navigate all the normal human desires and creative impulses and so on in the world, in the thick of life. Because if it's not something applicable in that, to me it's useless spirituality. If it doesn't help you to function in the world better, it's Pure Vilayat would call it the spiritual bypass. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to deal with this stuff. I want to just sit and meditate all day. Well, maybe you can get to really blissful states, but when you go out your door, you get every bit as caught up as you were before.
Yeah, there's this teaching in the Jesus story. Some of you might know about it. It's in the Gospel of John. And part of the story is about where Jesus is located. He's at a place, there's a community, his community of followers is on the border of Samaria and their own land, and is what we might call Israel or Judah. And they're in a place where they're not supposed to be, at the wrong time of day. They're at the middle of the day, and apparently Jesus is very, very hungry. I'll speed up the story. He has a very deep conversation with a woman at the well who has a very questionable background. This is a person that he is talking with who, as a religious leader, an acknowledged religious leader of the day, should not be around, and as a Jew should not be talking to a Samaritan woman. So there's all kinds of norms that he's breaking. There's all kinds of linear, two-dimensional things that he is breaking through in that entire moment. Okay, so that is a that I would call that a breakthrough quantum moment where this teacher, preacher, prophet, mystic is living in a different kind of reality. Okay? The end of that story is this. Prior to them arriving, the story says his disciples knew that he was hungry, and their job to provide for their master is to go to the community, to the town, nearby town, and get food, and they leave Jesus at the well. That's the reason for why Jesus is sitting at the well, is that apparently he's hungry and they need to go provide food for him. They're trying to live by this kind of linear world of there must be food and they must come back. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with Jesus needs some food. Let's leave him at the public place where we can find him when we come back, and we're going to go get food and take care of him. That's when Jesus has the conversation with the woman who has this questionable background, breaking all of these norms. After this woman, after he has this conversation, which is mind-blowingly awesome, I won't bore you with it here, she goes away completely transformed, becomes the herald that now goes and evangelizes that town, but other towns. Again, breaking the convention. She's a woman, she has a questionable background, but now she's the one that brings people to wisdom. And then when his disciples come back and find Jesus, he clearly looks like he's had a meal. He looks satiated and full and somehow radiating that he no longer is hungry. And the story tells us that they argue amongst themselves and with others who brought him food. And they say to him, who brought you food? Because they're feeling prideful that their pride-filled job has been interrupted. Mm-hmm. And he says to them, I have food you don't even know about.
And I've got to add on to this.
I've got nourishment that you don't even know about. That when we participate in that non-Newtonian, that non-linear, non-dualistic space, there might not only be life, but there might actually be nourishment that happens. And that's the possibility of living in a different space, aside from the illusion, breaking apart that illusion, that it might not only be nice and good, but it might actually be transformative and nourishing in a quantum, I would say quantum, that wasn't the language that was there then, but in a way that is beyond all ways, that is a mystery beyond all mysteries. That's early on, by the way, in the Gospel of John. My contention is that the rest of the Gospel of John is a continual reinterpretation of that kind of living that is an adventure, as one writer says, an adventure in the disciples and the people around Jesus radically missing the point. That they're trying to live in this reality and Jesus is living in this expansive reality. And lest you think I'm kind of reading more into it, it's worth remembering that John was very much writing out of a school, the Gnostic school, that rubbed elbows with what we now call the Sufi school, that had a lot of connection to mystical teaching and tradition. And it's not unlikely that John has some work or understanding of this broader kind of consciousness and reality.
Well, there's this idea in Judaism called eating the bread of shame. So what is this? It says in Judaism, if someone has become capable of bringing a light through their being that's particular to their own being, and bringing that forth and returning it, sharing it with the divine, but they want to keep it for themselves, they're partaking of the bread of shame. There's a story, and there's a beautiful picture in Alone with the Alone, which is a book by Henry Corbin about Ibn Arabi, of Abraham feeding the three angels. Feeding the angels? What? Why do angels need to eat? But there's this notion, and the Sufis talk a lot about this, that we are imparted with a light that descends from the divine being that created us, that continues to revivify our being and help to foster our potentials for transformation. But the way that light is transformed in us is returned to the divine, and that serves as a transformation to the very being of the divine, that we have that capability of doing that. So the point is not just us getting somewhere or us just doing good things in the world. Of course, that's important, but it's to have that capacity of bringing a light into existence that helps to bring about transformation. Well, it says in the scriptures, don't hide your light under a bushel. That's another way of saying that. Each of us has a unique light which the way I would describe that, it's a light that indicates our unique way of relating to anything and everything. That's the uniqueness of each of our being. It's our modality of relationship. It's not something fixed in our body or our minds or our personalities. And it's always evolving, and it's always contributing towards the evolution of everything else. And at some point we realize that we're all part of a grand divine human experiment of the furtherance of possibilities of divinity awakening in life, and what can arise from that. And that's never ending. There can never be a finish line to it, because if there was, there wouldn't be any meaning to it.